Chapter 11 of My Doggie and I by Robert Ballantyne. This recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Allyson Hester. Chapter 11 relates generally to the doings and sayings of Robin Slider. "My dear," said Mrs McTougall one evening to the doctor, "since that little boy Slider came to stay with us, things have become worse and worse. In fact, the house is almost unbearable." "My dear," responded Dr McTougall, "you amaze me. Surely the boy has not dared to be rude, insolent to you?" "Oh no, it's not that, but he must really be forbidden to enter the nursery. Our darlings, you know, were dreadful enough before he came, but since then they have become absolute maniacs." "You don't mean to say that the little rascal has been teaching them bad words or manners, I hope?" returned the doctor with a frown. "Dear me, no, papa, don't get angry," answered the anxious lady. "Far from it. On the contrary, I really believe that our darlings have greatly improved his language and manners by their example. But Robin's exuberant spirits are far too much for them. It is like putting fire to gunpowder, and they are so fond of him. That's the difficulty. The boy does not presume, I must say that for him, and he is very respectful to nurse. But the children are constantly asking him to come play with them, which he seems quite pleased to do, and then his mind is so eccentric, so inventive. The new games he devises are very ingenious, but so exceedingly dangerous and destructive that it is absolutely necessary to check him, and I want you to do it, dear." "I must know something of the nature of the mischief before I can check it," said the doctor. "Oh, it's indescribable," returned the lady. "The smell that he makes in the nursery with his chemical experiments is awful. And then poor Pompey, or Dumps, or whatever they call him, for they seem very undecided about his name, has not the life of, I was going to say, a dog with them. Only last night, when you were out, the ridiculous boy proposed the storming of an ogre's castle. Nurse was downstairs at the time, or it could never have happened. Well, of course, Robin was the ogre, darling Dolly was a princess whom he had stolen away, Jack was a prince who was to deliver her, and the others were the prince's retainers. A castle was built in one corner of all the tables and chairs in the room piled on each other, with one particular chair so ingeniously arranged that the pulling of it out would bring the castle in ruins to the ground. The plan of attack, as far as I could make out, was that the prince should ring our dinner bell at the castle gates and fiercely demand admittance, the demand to be followed by a burst from the trumpets, drums, and gongs of his soldiers. The ogre, seated on the castle top with the princess, after a few preliminary yells and howls, was to say, in a gruff voice, that he was too much engaged just then with his dinner, that 3 roast babies were being dished. When they were disposed of, the princess would be killed and served up as a sort of light pudding, after which he would open the castle gate. A horrible smell was to be created at this point to represent the roasting of the babies. This was to be the signal for a burst of indignation from the prince and his troops, who were to make a furious assault on the door, one of our largest tea trays, and after a little the prince was to pull away the particular chair and rush back with his men to avoid the falling ruin, while the ogre and princess were to find shelter under the nursery table, and then when the fall was over they were to be found dead among the ruins. I am not sure whether the princess was to be revived, or she was to have a grand funeral, but the play never got that length. I was sitting here, listening to the various sounds overhead, wondering what they could be about, when I heard a loud ringing. That was the castle bell. It was soon followed by a burst of toy trumpets and drums. A most disgusting smell began to permeate the house at the same time, for it seems that the ogre set fire to his chemicals too soon. Then I heard roaring and yelling, which really alarmed me, it was so gruff. When it stopped, there was a woeful howl. That was the burst of indignation. The assault came off next, and as the shouting of the troops was mingled with the hammering of the large tea tray, the ringing of the dinner bell, and the beating of the gong, you may fancy what the noise was. In the midst of it there was a hideous crash, accompanied by screams of alarm that were too genuine to be mistaken. I rushed up and found the furniture lying scattered over the room, with darling Dolly in the midst, the others standing in solemn silence around, and Robin Slidder sitting on the ground ruefully rubbing his head. The truth was that the particular chair had been pulled away before the proper time, and the castle had come down in ruins while the ogre and princess were still on top of it. Fortunately Robin saved Dolly at the expense of his own head and shoulder, by throwing his arms round her and falling undermost. But it was a narrow escape, and you really must put a stop to such reckless ongoings. The doctor promised to do so. "I have to send Robin a message this forenoon, and will administer a rebuke before sending him," he said. But it was plain, from the smile on the doctor's face, that the rebuke would not be severe. "Robin," he said, with much solemnity, when the culprit stood before him, "take this bottle of medicine to Mr. Williams, you know, the old place, and say I want to know how he is, and that I will call to morrow afternoon." "Yes, sir," said the boy, taking the bottle with an unusually subdued air. "And Robin, stop," continued the doctor. "I am told that the children were visited by an ogre last night?" "Yes, sir," answered the boy, with an uncertain glance at his questioner's grave face. "Well, Robin, you know where that ogre lives. Just call and tell him from me that if he or any of his relations ever come here again, I'll cause them to undergo extraction of the spinal marrow. Do you understand?" At first little Slidder felt inclined to laugh, but the doctor's face was so unusually stern that he thought better of it, and went away much impressed. Now Robin Slidder was no loiterer on his errands. Nevertheless, he did not deem it a breach of fidelity to cast an occasional glance into a picture shop window, or to pause a few seconds now and then to chaff a facetious cabby, or make a politely sarcastic remark to a bobby. His connection with what he termed high life had softened him down considerably, and given a degree of polish to his wit, but it had in no degree repressed his exuberant spirits. The distance he had to go being considerable, he travelled the latter part of the way by omnibus. Chancing to be in a meditative frame of mind that day, he climbed to the roof of the 'bus, and sat down with his hands thrust deep into his pockets, and his eyes deep into futurity. Whether he saw much there, I cannot tell; but after wandering for some time in that unknown region, his eyes returned to surrounding things, and, among other objects, alighted on the 'bus conductor, whose head was within a few inches of his toe. It was the head of the Slogger. That eccentric individual, having sprung up in a few months from the condition of a big boy to that of an exceedingly young man, had obtained a situation as conductor to a 'bus. He was so busy with his fares when Robin mounted the 'bus that he failed to observe him until the moment when the latter returned from futurity. Their eyes met simultaneously, and opened to such an extent that if size had counted for numbers they might have done for 4 boys. "Hallo, Buttons!" was the Slogger's exclamation. "Hallo, Slogger!" was that of Robin. "Well, now, this is a pleasure. Who'd have thought it?" said the conductor, reaching up his hand. "Is that for your fare or a shake, Slogger?" demanded Robin. "A shake, of course, old feller," replied the other, as Robin grasped the proffered hand. "But I say," he added in a lower key, "there's no Slogger now in this 'ere world. He's dead and buried long ago. My name is Villum Bowls. No connection whatever with Slogger. Oh no, we never mention him. But I say, when did you go to the Gentile line, Slidder?" "Robin. Robin is my name now, Villum Bowls. I've changed it since we met last, though I ain't cut old friends like you. Robin and Slidder have been united, and a pretty pair they make, don't they?" "Middlin'. Hold on till I get that ancient stout party shoved in. Looks as if he was goin' in the opposite direction, but it don't matter so long as we can get him in. Now then, sir, mind the step. All right. I say, Slide, Robin, I mean." "Vell, Slog, Willem, I mean. Why don't you say what you mean, eh?" "'Ow do you like grey tights and buttons?" said the Slogger with a bland smile. "So," replied Robin with a careless air. "The grey is sober enough, quite suitable to my character, and I confess I'm fond of the buttons." "There's enough of 'em to form a goodish overcoat almost," said the Slogger with a critical grin, "but I should have thought 'em not sufficiently waterproof in wet weather." "Vell, they ain't much use for that, Willem, but you should see the dazzling display they makes in sunshine. Why, you can see me half a mile off when I chance to be walking in Regent Street or driving in the Park, but I value them chiefly because of the frequent and pleasant talks they get me with the ladies." "You don't mean for to say, Robin, that the ladies ever holds you by the buttonholes?" "No, I don't, but I holds them with the buttons. This is the way of it. When I chance to see a very pretty lady, not one of your beauties, you know, I don't care a dump for them stuck up creatures, but one of your sweet, amiable sort, with souls above buttons, and faces one likes to look at and to kiss when you've a right to, vell, when I sees one of those, I brushes up agin her and 'ooks on with my buttons to some of her togs. If she takes it ill, looks cross, and 'alf inclined to use strong language, I makes a 'umble apology and gets undone as fast as possible. But if she larfs and says, 'Stupid boy, why don't you look before you?' or something o' that sort, I just 'ooks on another tag to another button when we're a fumbling at the first one, and so goes on till we get to be quite sociable over it. I might almost say confidential. Once or twice I've been the victim of misjudgment, and got a heavy slap on the face from angelic hands that ought to have known better, but on the 'ole I'm willin' to take my chance." "Not a bad notion," remarked the Slogger, "especially for a pretty little chap like you, Robin." "Right you are," replied the other, "but you needn't try on the dodge yourself, for it would never pay with a big ugly grampus like you, Willem." Having thus run into a pleasant little chat, the two waifs proceeded to compare notes, in the course of which comparison the Slogger gave an outline of his recent history. He had been engaged in several successful burglaries, but had been caught in the act of pocket picking, for which offence he had spent some weeks in prison. While there, a visitor had spoken to him very earnestly, and advised him to try an honest life, as being, to say the least of it, easier work than thieving. He had made the attempt. Through the influence of the same prison visitor he had obtained a situation, from which he had been advanced to the responsible position which he then held. "And you know, Robin," said the Slogger, "I find that honesty pays pretty well, and I means to stick to it." "And I suppose," said Robin, "if it didn't pay pretty well, you'd cut it?" "Of course I would," returned the Slogger with a look of surprise. "What's the use of sticking to a thing that don't pay?" "Vell, if them's your principles, you ain't got much to 'old on by, my tulip," said Robin. "And what principles may you 'old on by, my turnip?" asked the Slogger. "It would puzzle me rather to tell that," returned Robin, "'specially talking down to the level of my own toes on the top of a bus. But I'll tell you what, Willem, if you'll come to number 6 Grovelly Street, Shadwell Square, just back of Hoboy Crescent, where my master lives, on Sunday next at 7 in the evening, you'll hear and see something as'll open your eyes." "Ah, a meetin' house?" said the Slogger, with a slight smile of contempt. "Musicals and publics is meetin' 'ouses, ain't they?" "Ah, but they ain't prayer meetin' 'ouses," rejoined the Slogger. "Not so sure o' that, Willem. There's a deal o' prayer in such places sometimes, and it's well for the visitors that their prayers ain't always answered. But our meetin' 'ouse is more than just for prayer, a deal more, and there's my young missus, A real angel comes in and holds forth there every Sunday evening to young fellers like you and me. You just come and judge for yourself." "No, thank ye," returned the Slogger. As he spoke, a lady with a lap dog made powerful demonstrations with her umbrella. The bus stopped, and the conductor attended to his duties, while Robin, who really felt a strong desire to bring his old comrade under an influence which he knew was working wonderful change in himself, sat meditating sadly on the obstinacy of human nature. "I say, Robin," said the Slogger, on resuming his perch, "d'ye know I found traces of that young gal as you took such an interest in, as runned away from the old 'ooman, and was robbed by the Brassy and me?" "You don't mean that!" exclaimed Robin eagerly. "Yes, I do. She's in London, I believe, but I can't exactly say where. I heard of her through Sal. You know Sal, who 'angs out at the vest end of Potter's Lane. I expect to see Sal in 'alf an hour, so if you're comin' back this way, I'll be at the Black Bull by 2 o'clock, and tell you all I can pump out of her." "I'll be there sharp," said Robin promptly. "And now pull up, for I must take to my legs here." "But I say, Robin, if we do find that gal, you won't split on me, eh? You won't tell her who I am or where I is? You won't victimize your old friend?" "D'ye take me for an informer?" demanded Robin, with an offended look. "All right," cried the Slogger, giving the signal to drive on. Robin sped quickly away, executed his mission, and returned to the Black Bull in a state of considerable excitement and strong hope. Slidder was doomed to be disappointed. He reached the Black Bull at 2 o'clock precisely. "Vell, my fair one," he said, addressing a waiting maid who met him in the passage, "it's good for sore eyes to see the likes o' you in cloudy weather. D'ye happen to know a young man of the name of Villum Bowles?" "Yes, I do, Mr. Imperence," answered the girl. "You couldn't introduce me to him, could you, Miss Sunshine?" "No, I couldn't, because he isn't here, and won't likely be back for 2 hours." This reply took all the humour out of Robin's tone and manner. He resolved, however, to wait for half an hour, and went out to saunter in front of the hotel. Half an hour passed, then another, and the boy was fain to leave the spot in despair. Poor Slidder's temperament was sanguine. Slight encouragement raised his hopes very high. Failure depressed him proportionally and woefully low. But, to do him justice, he never sorrowed long. In the present instance he left the Black Bull grinding his teeth. Then he took to clanking his heels as he walked along in a way that drew forth the comments of several street boys, to whom, in a spirit of liberality, he returned considerably more than he received. Then he began to mutter between his teeth his private opinion as to faithless persons in general, and faithless Villum, alias the Slogger, in particular, whose character he painted to himself in extremely sombre colours. After that, a heavy thunder shower having fallen and drenched him, he walked recklessly and violently through every puddle in his path. This seemed to relieve his spirit, for when he reached Hoboy Crescent he had recovered much of his wonted equanimity. The Slogger was not, however, so faithless as his old friend imagined. He had been at the Black Bull before 2 o'clock, but had been sent off by his employer with a note to a house at a considerable distance in such urgent haste that he had not had time to even think of leaving a message for his friend. In these circumstances he resolved to clear his character by paying a visit on the following Sunday to No. 6 Grovelly Street, Shadwell Square. Chapter 12 of My Doggie and I, by Robert Ballantyne. This recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Allyson Hester. Chapter 12 begins with love, hope, and joy, and ends peculiarly. It may not, perhaps, surprise the reader to learn that after Lily Blythe's return to town I did not prosecute my studies with as much enthusiasm as before. In fact, I divided my attentions pretty equally between Lily and chemistry. Now, I am not prone to become sentimentally talkative about my own affairs, but as courtship and love and that sort of thing are undoubted and important elements in the chemistry of human affairs, and as they influenced me and those around me to some extent, I cannot avoid making reference to them, but I promise the reader to do so only as far as appears necessary for the elucidation of my story. First, then, although I knew that my prospects of success as a partner of Dr McTougall were most encouraging, I felt that it would be foolish to think of marriage until my position was well established and my income adequate. I, therefore, strove with all my might to check the flow of my thoughts towards Miss Blythe. As well might I have striven to restrain the flow of Niagara. True love cannot be stemmed. In my case, however, the proverb was utterly falsified, for my true love did run smooth. More than that, it ran fast, very fast indeed, so much so that I was carried, as it were, on the summit of a rushing flood tide into the placid harbour of engagement. The anchorage in that harbour is with many people uncertain. With Lily and me it was not so. The ground tackle was good. It had caught hold of a rock and held on. It happened thus. After many weeks of struggling on my part to keep out of Miss Blythe's way, and to prevent the state of my feelings from being observed by her, struggles which I afterwards found to my confusion had been quite obvious to her, I found myself standing alone, one Sunday afternoon, in the doctor's drawing room, meditating on the joys of childhood, as exemplified by thunderous blows on the floor above, and piercing shouts of laughter. The children had been to church, and were working off the steam accumulated there. Suddenly there was a dead silence, which I knew to be the result of a meal. The meal was, I may add, the union of a late dinner with an early tea. It was characteristic of Sundays in the McTougall nursery. The thought of this union turned my mind into another channel. Just then Miss Blythe entered. She looked so radiant that I forgot myself, forgot my former struggles, my good resolutions, everything except herself, and proposed on the spot. I was rejected, of course. More than that, I was stunned. Hope had told me many flattering tales. Indeed, I had felt so sure, from many little symptoms, that Lily had a strong regard for me, to say the least, that I was overwhelmed, not only by my rejection, but by the thought of my foolish self-assurance. "I don't wonder that you look upon me as a presumptuous, vain, contemptible fellow," said I, in the bitterness of my soul. "But I do not regard you in that light," said Lily, with a faint smile, and then, hesitatingly, she looked down at the carpet. "In what light do you regard me, Miss Blythe?" said I, recovering a little hope, and speaking vehemently. "Really, Dr Mellon, you take me by surprise. Your manner so abrupt, so—" "Oh, never mind manner, dear Miss Blythe," said I, seizing her hand and forcibly detaining it. "You are the soul of truth. Tell me, is there any hope for me? Can you care for me?" "Dr Mellon," she said, drawing her hand firmly away, "I cannot, should not reply. You do not know all the circumstances of my life, my poverty, my solitary condition in the world, my—" "Miss Blythe," I exclaimed in desperation, "if you were as poor as a church rat, as solitary as Adam before the advent of Eve, I would count it my chief joy and—" "Hallo, Mellon! Hi, I say, where are you?" shouted the voice of the doctor at that moment from below stairs. "Here's Dumps been in the laboratory and capsized some of the chemicals." "Coming, sir!" I shouted. Then tenderly, though hurriedly, to Miss Blythe, "You will let me resume this subject at—" "Hallo, look sharp!" from below. "Yes, I'll be down directly. Dear Miss Blythe, if you only knew—" "Why, the dog's burning all over! Help me!" roared the doctor. Miss Blythe blushed and laughed. How could she help it? I hastily kissed her hand and fled from the room. That was the whole affair. There was not enough, strictly speaking, to form a ground of hope, but somehow I knew that it was all right. In the laboratory I found Dumps smoking, and the doctor pouring water from the tap on his dishevelled body. He was not hurt, and little damage was done; but as I sat in my room talking to him that evening, I could not help reproaching him with having been the means of breaking off one of the most important interviews of my life. "However, Dumps," I continued, "your good services far outweigh your wicked deeds, and whatever you may do in the future, I will never forget that you were the means of introducing me to that angel, Lilly Blythe." The angel in question went that Sunday evening at 7 o'clock, as was her wont, to a Bible class which she had started for the instruction of some of the poor neglected boys and lads who idled about in the dreary back streets of our aristocratic neighbourhood. The boys had become so fond of her that they were eager to attend, and usually assembled round the door of the class room before the hour. My protégé, Robin Slidder, was of course one of her warmest adherents. He was standing that night apart from the other boys, contemplating the proceedings of two combative sparrows which quarrelled over a crumb of bread on the pavement, and had just come to the conclusion that men and sparrows had some qualities in common, when he was attracted by a low whistle, and, looking up, beheld the Slogger peeping round a neighbouring corner. "Hallo, Willum, I mean! How are ya? Come along. Vell, I am glad to see you, for d'ye know, arter you failed me that day at the Black Bull, I've been giving you a purty bad character, and calling you no end o' bad names." "Is that what your angel teaches you, Robin?" "Vell, not exactly, but you'll hear what she teaches for yourself to night, I hope. Come, I'm right glad to see you, Willum. What was it that prevented you that day, eh?" When the Slogger had explained and cleared his character, Robin asked him eagerly if he had ascertained anything further about the girl whom he and Brassey had robbed. "Of course I have," said the Slogger, "and it's a curious succumstance that her place of abode, so Sally says, is in the Vest End, not very far from here. She gave me the street and the name, but wasn't quite sure of the number." "Vell, come along, let's hear all about it," said Robin impatiently. "Why, what's your hurry?" returned the Slogger slowly. "I ain't goin' away till I've heerd what your angel's got to say, you know. Besides, I must go arter your meeting's over and watch the 'ouse till I see the gallon, make sure it's her, for Sally may have been mistook, you know." "You don't know her name, do you?" asked Robin. "It wasn't Edie Willis, now, was it?" "'Ow should I know her name?" answered the Slogger. "D'ye think I stopped to inquire when I 'elped to relieve her of her property?" "I suppose not. Vell, I suppose you've no objection to my goin' to watch along with ye?" "None whatsomever. Only remember, if it do turn out to be her, you won't betray me. Honour bright. She may be revengeful, you know, and might 'ave me took up if she got 'old of me." Robin Slidder faithfully and earnestly pledged himself. While he was speaking, there was a general movement among the lads and boys towards the class room, for Miss Blythe was seen coming towards them. The two friends moved with the rest. Just as he was about to enter the door, Robin missed his companion, and, looking back, saw him bending down and holding his sides as if in pain. "What's wrong now?" he inquired, returning to him. "Oh, I'm took so bad," said the Slogger, looking very red, and rubbing himself. "A old complaint as I thought I was cured of. Oh dear! You'll 'ave to excuse me, Robin, and I'll go and take a turn and come in if I gets better. If not, I'll meet you round the corner arter it's over." So saying, the Slogger, turning round, walked quickly away, and his little friend entered the class room in a state of mind pendulating between disgust and despair, for he had no expectation of seeing the slippery Slogger again that night. When the meeting was over, Miss Blythe returned home. I saw her enter the library. No one else was there, I knew. The gas had not yet been lighted, and only a faint flicker from the fire illuminated the room. Unable to bear the state of uncertainty under which my mind still laboured, I resolved to make assurance doubly sure, or quit the house and England for ever. I spare the reader the details. Suffice it to say that after much entreaty I got her to admit that she loved me, but she refused to accept me until she had told me her whole history. "Then I'm sure of you now," said I in triumph. "For, be your history what it may, I'll never give up on you, dearest Lilly." "Don't call me Lilly," she said in a low, quiet tone. "It is only a pet name which the little ones here gave me on my first coming to them. Call me Edith." "I will," said I with enthusiasm. "A far more beautiful name. Hello! Hi, Mellon! Are you there?" For the second time that day Dr. Toogle interrupted me, but I was proof against annoyance now. "Yes, I'm here," I shouted, running downstairs. "Surely Dumps is not burning himself again, eh?" "Oh, no," returned my friend with a laugh. "Only a telegram. However, it's important enough to require prompt attention. The Gordons in Bingley Manor, you know them, telegraphed me to run down immediately. Old lady ill. Now, it unfortunately happens that I have an engagement this evening which positively cannot be put off, so I must send you. Besides, I know well enough what it is. They're easily alarmed, and I'm convinced it is just the old story. However, the summons must be obeyed. You will go for me. The train starts in half an hour. You will have plenty of time to catch it, if you make haste. You'll have to stay all night. No return train till to-morrow, being an out-of-the-way place. There, off with you. Put the telegram in your pocket for the address." So saying, the doctor put on his hat and left the house. Summoning Robin Slidder, I bade him to pack a few things into my travelling bag while I wrote a note. When he had finished, he told me of his interview with the Slogger. I was greatly interested, and asked if he had gone to see his friend after the meeting. "No, sir, I didn't. I meant to, but Miss Blythe wanted me to walk home with her. It was so dark, and when I went back he had gone." "Pity, Robin, a great pity," said I, hastily strapping up my bag. "But no doubt he'll come here to see you again. Now, don't forget to take over that parcel of tea and sugar, etc., to Mrs Willis. Go as soon as you can." Saying this, I left the house. The new residence of the old woman being so near to Hoboy Crescent, the parcel was soon delivered, and Robin officiated at the opening of it, also at the preparing and consuming of some of its contents. Of course he chatted vigorously, as was his wont, but was particularly careful to make not the most distant allusion to the Slogger or his reports, being anxious not to arouse her hopes until he should have some evidence that they were on a true scent. Indeed, he was so fearful of letting slip some word or remark on the subject, and thereby awakening suspicion and giving needless pain, that he abstained from all reference to the meeting of that evening, and launched out instead into wonderful and puzzling theological speculations, of which he was very fond. Meanwhile, I was carried swiftly into the country. The lamp in my carriage was too dim to permit of reading. I therefore wrapped myself in my rug, and indulged in pleasant meditations. It was past midnight when I arrived at the station for Bingley Manor, where I found a gig awaiting me. A sharp drive of half an hour, and I was at the mansion door. Dr McTougall was right. There was little the matter with old Mrs Gordon, but the family were nervous and rich, hence my visit. I did what was necessary for the patient, comforted the rest by my presence, had a sound night's rest, an early breakfast, a pleasant drive in the fresh frosty air, and a brief wait of 5 minutes when the punctual train came up. There is something inexpressibly delightful in a ride, on a sharp frosty morning, in an express train. I have always felt a wild bounding sensation of joy in rapid motion. The pace at which we went that morning was exceptionally charming. Had I known that the engine driver was intoxicated, perhaps it might not have been quite so exhilarating; but I did not know that. I sat comfortably in my corner thinking of Edith, and gazing with placid benignity at the frosted trees and bushes which sparkled in the red wintry sun. Yes, it was a glorious ride. I never had a better. The part of the country through which we passed was lovely. One can always gaze comfortably at the distant landscape from a railway carriage, however great the speed. As for the immediate foreground, it reminded me of a race. Houses, trees, farms, towns, villages, hamlets, horses, sheep, cattle, poultry, hayricks, brickfields, were among the competitors in that race. They rushed in mad confusion to the rear. I exulted in the pace. Not so a stout elderly gentleman in the opposite direction, who evidently disliked it. So true is it that one man's meat is another's poison. "There's no reason to fear, sir," said I, with a smile by way of reassuring him. "This is a most excellently managed line. One never hears of accidents on it." "Too fast just now, anyhow," returned the elderly gentleman testily. Just then the whistle was heard sounding violently. "That's a sign of safety," said I. "Shows they are on the alert." A severe application of the brakes caused me to stop abruptly, and the elderly man to seize the arms of his seat with a convulsive grasp. Suddenly there was a mighty crash. The sensations in my mind that followed were suggestive of cannons, rockets, bombs, fireworks, serpents, shooting stars, and tumbling debris. Then all was dark and silent as the grave. Chapter 13 of My Doggie and I, by Robert Ballantyne. This recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Allyson Hester. Chapter 13. A Wonderful Discovery. Slowly recovering consciousness, I found myself lying on the floor of a waiting room, with a gentleman bending over me. Instantly recollecting what had occurred, I endeavoured to start up, but was obliged to fall back again. "You must lie quiet, sir," said the gentleman. "You're not much hurt. We will send you on, if you choose, by the train that is expected in a few minutes." "Is the elderly gentleman safe?" I asked eagerly. "Which elderly gentleman? There were several in the train, but none are injured, I believe, though some are much shaken. Nobody has been killed. It has been quite a miraculous escape." "Merciful! Call it merciful, dear sir," said I, looking upwards and thanking God with all my heart for sparing my life. 2 days after that I lay on the drawing room sofa in Hoboy Crescent. Mr. and Mrs. McTougall had gone out. So had the children, the forenoon being fine. Edith had remained at home, for reasons which she did not see fit to divulge. She sat beside me with one of her hands in mine. It was all arranged between us by that time. "Edith," said I, after a short pause in our conversation, "I have long wanted to tell you about a dear little old lady with whom Robin Slidder and I have had much to do. She's one of my poor patients, whom I have not mentioned to you before, but I've heard something about her lately which makes me wish to ask you your advice, perhaps your aid, in a rather curious search which I've been engaged in for a long time past." "I will go for my work, John, and you shall tell me all about it," she replied, rising. "I shall be 5 or 10 minutes in preparing it. Can you wait patiently?" "Well, I'll try, though of course it will be like a separation of 5 or 10 years. But Dumps and I will solace each other in your absence. By the way, touch the bell as you pass. I should like to see Robin, not having had a talk with him since the accident." When Robin appeared, I asked him if he had seen the Slogger. "No, sir, I 'aven't," replied Robin, with a somewhat cross look. "That there Slogger has played me false these 2 times.
Leastwise, though he couldn't help it the fust time, he's got to clear hisself about the second." "You know where the Slogger lives, don't you?" I asked. "Oh, yes, but it's a long, long way off, and I durstn't go without leave, and since you was blowed up in the train, I've scarce had a word with the doctor. He's been busy through having your patients on his hands as well as his own." "Well, Robin, I give you leave to go. Be off this very hour, and see that you bring me back some good news. Now that we have reason to believe the poor girl is in London, perhaps near us, I cannot rest until we find her, or prove the scent to have been a false one. Away with you." As the boy went out, Edith came back with her work basket. "I've been thinking," said I, as she sat down on a stool beside me, "that before beginning my story, it would be well that you should unburden your dear little heart of that family secret of yours which you thought at first was a sufficient bar to our union. But before you begin, let me solemnly assure you that your revelations, whatever they are, will utterly fail to move me. Though you should declare yourself to be the daughter of a thief, a costermonger, or a chimpanzee monkey, though you should profess yourself to have been a charwoman, a foundling, a Billingsgate fishwoman, or a female mountebank, my feelings and resolves will remain the same. Sufficient for me to know that you are you, and that you are mine. There, go on."
"Truly, then, if such be your feelings, there is no need of my going on, or even beginning," she replied with a smile, and yet with a touch of sadness in her tone which made me grasp her hand.
"Ah, Edith, I didn't mean to hurt you by my jesting, and yet the spirit of what I say is true, absolutely true."
"You did not hurt me, John. You merely brought to my remembrance a great sorrow, and—"
"Your great sorrow!" I exclaimed in surprise, gazing at her smooth young face.
"Yes, my great sorrow, and I was going to add, my loss. But you shall hear. I have no family mystery to unfold. All that I wished you to know on that head was that I am without a family altogether. All are dead. I have no relation on earth, not one." She said this with such deep pathos, while tears filled her eyes, that I could not have uttered a word of comfort to save my life. "And," she continued, "I am absolutely penniless. These 2 points at first made me repel you, at least until I had explained them to you. Now that you look upon them as such trifles, I need say no more. But the loss to which I have referred is, I fear, irreparable. You won't think me selfish or tiresome if I go back to an early period of my history?"
"Selfish! Tiresome!" I repeated. "Oh, Edith!"
"Well, then, many years ago my father and mother lived by the seashore not far from Yarmouth. They were poor. My father gave lessons in French, my mother taught music. But they earned sufficient to support themselves and my grandmother and me in comfort. We were a very happy family, for we all loved God and tried to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. I gave them, indeed, a great deal of trouble at first, but He overcame my stubborn heart at last. And then there was nothing to mar the happiness of our lives. But sickness came. My father died. My mother tried to struggle on for a time, but could not earn enough. I tried to help her by teaching, but had myself need of being taught. At last we changed our residence, in hopes of getting more remunerative employment, but in this we failed. Then my mother fell sick and died." She stopped at this point.
"Oh, Edith, this makes you doubly dear," said I, drawing her nearer to me.
In a few minutes she continued: "Being left alone now with my grandmother, I resolved to go to London and try to find employment in the great city. We had not been long here, and I had not yet obtained employment when an extraordinary event occurred which has ever since embittered my life. I went out for a walk one day and was robbed."
"How strange!" I exclaimed.
half rising from the sofa.
"What a curious coincidence!"
"What? How? What do you mean?" she asked, looking at me in surprise.
"Never mind just now. When I come to tell you my story, you'll understand. There is a robbery of a young girl in it, too. Go on."
"Well, then, as I said, I was robbed by a man and a boy. I had dear little Pompey with me at the time, and that is the way I came to lose him. But the terrible thing was that an accident befell me just after I was robbed, and I never saw my darling grandmother again."
"Coincidence!"
I exclaimed, starting up, as a sudden thought was forced upon my mind, and my heart began to beat violently.
"This is more than a coincidence, and yet it cannot be. Pooh! Impossible! Ridiculous! My mind is wandering."
I sank back somewhat exhausted, for I had been considerably weakened by my accident. Edith was greatly alarmed at my words and looks, and blamed herself for having talked too much to me in my comparatively weak condition.
"No, you have not talked too much to me. You cannot do that, dear Edie," I said.
It was now her turn to look bewildered. "Edie," she echoed. "Why do you call me Edie?" I covered my eyes with my hand, that she might not see their expression.
"There can be no doubt now," I thought. "But why the name of Blythe?"
Then aloud,
"It is a pretty contraction for Edith, is it not? Don't you like it?"
"Like it? Yes. Oh, how much! But
"Well, Edie," I said, laying powerful restraint on myself, and looking her calmly in the face, "you must bear with me to night. You know that weakness sometimes causes men to act unaccountably. Forgive me for interrupting you. I won't do it again, as the naughty boys say. Go on, dear, with your story."
I once more covered my eyes with my hand, as if to shade them from the light, and listened, though I could scarcely conceal my agitation. "The name of Edie," she continued, "is that by which my darling granny always called me, and it sounded so familiar, yet so strange, coming from your lips. But after all, it is a natural abbreviation. Well, as I said, an accident befell me. I had burst away from the thieves in a state of wild horror, and was attempting to rush across a crowded thoroughfare, when a cab knocked me down. I felt a sharp pang of pain, heard a loud shout, and then all was dark. On recovering, I found myself lying in one of the beds of a hospital. My collar bone had been broken, and I was very feverish, scarcely understood where I was, and felt a dull sense of oppression on my brain. They spoke to me, and asked my name. I don't remember distinctly how I pronounced it, but I recollect being somewhat amused at their misunderstanding what I said, and calling me Miss Eva Bright. I felt too ill to correct them at the time, and afterwards became so accustomed to Eva, for I was a very long time there, that I did not think it worth while to correct the mistake. This was very foolish and unfortunate, for long afterwards, when I began to get well enough to think coherently, and sent them to let granny know where I was, they of course went with the name of Eva Bright. It was very stupid, no doubt, but I was so weak and listless after my long and severe illness, that this never once occurred to me. As it turned out, however, there would have been no difference in the result, for my darling had left her lodging and gone no one knew where. This terrible news brought on a relapse, and for many weeks, I believe, my life hung on a thread. But that thread was in the hand of God, and I had no fear."
"What is the name, Edie, of the grandmother you have lost?" I asked in a low, tremulous voice.
"Willis? But why do you start so? Now I am quite sure you have been more severely hurt than you imagine, and that my talking so much is not good for you."
"No, Edie, no. Go on," I said firmly.
"I have little more to tell," she continued. "Dr McTougall had attended me in the hospital, and took a fancy to me. When I was well enough to leave, he took me home to be governess to his children, but my situation has been an absolute sinecure as yet, for he says I am not strong enough to work, and won't let me do anything. It was not till after I had left the hospital that I told my kind friend the mistake that had been made about my name, and about my lost grandmother. He has been very kind about that, and assisted me greatly, at first, in my search for her. But there are so many people of the name of Willis in London, old ladies too. We called together on so many that he got tired of it at last. Of course I wrote to various people at York, and to the place where we had lived before going there, but nothing came of it. And now my hopes have long ago died out, that is to say, almost, but I still continue to make inquiries." She paused here for some time, and I did not move or speak, being so stunned by my discovery that I knew not what to say, and feared to reveal the truth to Edith too suddenly. Then I knew by the gentle way in which she moved that she thought I had fallen asleep. I was glad of this, and remained quietly thinking. There was no doubt in my mind that Edie Blythe was this long lost granddaughter of old Mrs Willis, but the name still remained an insoluble mystery. "Edie," said I abruptly, "is your name Blythe?" "Of course it is," she said in startled surprise. "Why should you doubt it?" "I don't doubt it," said I, "but I'm sorely puzzled. Why is it not Willis?" "Why?" exclaimed Edie with a little laugh. "Because I am the daughter of Granny Willis's daughter, not of her son. My father's name was Blythe." The simplicity of this explanation, and my gross stupidity in quietly assuming from the beginning, as a matter of course, that the lost Edie's name was the same as her grandmother's, burst upon me in its full force. The delusion had been naturally perpetuated by Mrs Willis never speaking of her lost darling except by her Christian name. For a few seconds I was silent. Then I exploded in almost an hysterical fit of laughter, in the midst of which I was interrupted by the sudden entrance of my doggie, who had returned from a walk with Robin, and began to gambol round his mistress as if he had not seen her for years. "Oh, sir, I say, I've diskivered all about—" Little Slidder had rushed excitedly into the room, but stopped abruptly on observing Miss Blythe, who was looking from him to me with intense surprise. Before another word could be said, a servant entered. "Please, Miss Blythe, Dr McTougall wishes to see you in his study." She left us at once. "Now, Robin," said I, with emphasis, "sit down on that chair opposite me, and let's hear all about it." The excited boy obeyed, and Dumps, leaping on another chair beside him, sat down to listen, with ears erect, as if he knew what was coming. "Oh, sir, you never such a go!" began Robin, rubbing his hands together slowly as he spoke. "The Slogger, he twigged her at once. You'll open your eyes so wide you'll never get 'em shut again when you hears. No, I never did see such a lark. Edie's found. I've seen her. She ain't the queen, oh no, nor yet one of the queen's darters, by no means, nor yet a duchess, oh dear no, though she's like one. Who d'ye think she is? But you'll never guess." "I'll try," said I, with a quiet smile, for I had subdued myself that time. "Try away then. Who?" "Miss Edith Blythe." On hearing this, little Slidder's eyes began to open and glisten till they outshone his own buttons. "Why, how ever did you come to guess it?" gasped the boy, on recovering himself. "I did not guess it. I found it out. Do you suppose that nobody can find out things except Sloggers and pages and buttons?" "Oh, sir, do tell!" entreated the boy. I did tell, and after we had each told each other all that we knew, we mentally hugged ourselves, and grew so facetious over it that we began to address Dumps personally, to that intelligent creature's intense satisfaction. "Now, Robin," said I, "we must break this very cautiously to the old lady and Miss Blythe."
Oh, and of course, very cautiously, assented the urchin with inconceivable earnestness. Well, then, off you go and fetch my greatcoat. We'll go visit Miss Willis at once. At once, echoed Robin as he ran out of the room with blazing cheeks and sparkling eyes. Lily, said Dr McTougall as Edith entered his consulting room, I'm just off to see a patient who is very ill, and there is another who is not quite so ill, but who also wants to see me. I'll send you to the latter as my female assistant, if you will go. Her complaint is chiefly mental. In fact, she needs comfort more than physic, and I know of no one who is comparable to you in that line. Can you go?" "Certainly, with pleasure. I'll go at once." "Her name," said the doctor, "is Willis. By the way, that reminds me of your loss, dear girl," he continued in a lower tone as he gently took her hand. "But I would not again arouse your hopes. You know how many old women of this name we have seen without finding her." "Yes, I know too well," returned poor Edith, while the tears gathered in her eyes. "I have long ago given up all hope." But notwithstanding her statement, Edith had not quite given way to despair. In spite of herself, her heart fluttered a little as she sped on this mission to the abode of another old Mrs. Willis. Chapter 14 of My Doggie and I, by Robert Ballantyne. This recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Allyson Hester. Chapter 14. The Last. When Robin and I reached the abode of our old friend, in a state, let me add, of almost irrepressible excitement, we found her seated in the old arm chair by the window, gazing sadly out on the prospect. It was not now the prospect of red brick and waterspout, with a remote distance of chimney, cans and cats, which had crushed the old lady's spirit in other days. By no means. There was a picturesque little court, with an old pump in the centre to awaken the fancy, and frequent visits from more or less diabolical street boys to excite the imagination. Beyond that, there was the mews, in which a lively scene of variance between horses and men was enacted from morning till night, a scene which derived much additional charm from the fact that Mrs. Willis, being short-sighted, formed fearfully incorrect estimates of men and beasts and things in general. "Well, granny, how are you?" said I, seating myself on a stool beside her, and thinking how I should begin. "Pretty griggy, eh?" inquired little Slidder. "Ah, there you are, my dear boys," said the old lady, who had latterly got to look upon me and my protege as brothers. "You are always sure to come, whoever fails me." "Has any one failed you to day, granny?" I asked. "Yes, Dr McTougall has," she replied as petulantly as it was possible for her to speak. "I've been feeling very low and weak to day, and sent for him, but I suppose he thinks it's only imagination. Well, perhaps it is," she added after a pause, and with a little sigh. "I'm very foolish, no doubt." "No, granny," said I, "you are not foolish." "Contrariwise, very much the reverse," interrupted Slidder. "And I'm glad that I chanced to come in, because, perhaps, I may be able to prescribe for you as well as he." "Better, dear boy, better." "That's it, cheer up," from Slidder. "And it always does me a world of good to see your handsome face." "Well, granny," said I, with a flutter at my heart, as I looked up at her thin, careworn face, and began to break the ice with caution, "I've come there's a little piece of "Now then, dig in the spurs, doctor, and go at it, neck or nothing," murmured my impatient companion. "What are you saying, Robin?" asked Mrs. Willis, with a slightly anxious look. "There's nothing wrong, I hope?" "No, nothing wrong, granny," said I, hastening to the point. "Very much the reverse. But you heard of my accident, of course," I said, suddenly losing heart and beating around the bush. "Stuck again," murmured Slidder, in a tone of disgust. "Yes, yes, I heard of it. You don't mean to say you're getting worse?" said the old lady, with increasing anxiety. "Oh no, I'm better, much better. Indeed, I don't think I've ever felt so well in my life. And I've just heard a piece of good news, which I'm quite sure will make you very glad indeed." "Go it, sir. Another burst like that, and you'll be clear out of the wood," murmured Slidder. "In fact," said I, as a sudden thought struck, "I'm going to be married." "Whew! You never told me that!" exclaimed Slidder, with widening eyes. "Will you be quiet, Robin?" said I, rather sternly. "How can I get over this very difficult matter, if you go on interrupting me so?" "Mum's the word," returned the boy, folding his hands, and assuming a look of ridiculous solemnity. At that moment we heard a noise of pattering feet on the landing outside. The door, which had not been properly closed, burst open, and my doggie came into the room all of a heap. After a brief moment lost in apparently searching for his hind legs, he began to dance and frisk about the room as if all his limbs were whalebone and his spirit quicksilver. "Oh, there's that dog again! Put it out! Put it out!" cried Mrs Willis, gathering her old skirts around her feet. "Get out, Dumps! How dare you come here, sir, without leave?" "I gave him leave," said a sweet voice in the passage. Next moment a sweeter face was smiling upon me as Edith entered the room. There was a feeble cry at the window. I observed that the sweet smile vanished, and a deadly pallor overspread Edith's face, while her eyes gazed with eager surprise at the old lady for a few seconds. Mrs Willis sat with an answering gaze and outstretched arms. "Edie!" "Granny!" was all that either could gasp, but there was no need for more. The lost ones were mutually found. With an indescribable cry of joy, Edith sprang forward, fell on her knees, and enfolded her granny in her arms. "Here you are, doctor," whispered Robin, touching me on the elbow and presenting a tumbler of water. "How? What?" "She'll need it, doctor. I knows her well, and it's the only thing as does her good when she's took bad." Slidder was right. The shock of joy was almost too much for the old lady. She leaned heavily on her granddaughter's neck, and if I had not caught her, both must have fallen to the ground. We lifted her gently into bed, and in a few minutes she recovered. For some time she lay perfectly still. Edith, reclining on the lowly couch, rested her fair young cheek on the withered old one. Presently Mrs Willis moved, and Edith sat up. "John," said the former to me, looking at the latter, "this is my Edie, thanks be to the Lord." "Yes, granny, I know it, and she's my Edie too." A surprised and troubled look came on her old face. She evidently was pained to think that I could jest at such a moment. I hastened to relieve her. "It is the plain and happy truth that I tell you, granny. Edith is engaged to marry me. Is it not so?" I turned towards the dear girl, who silently put one of her hands in mine. Old Mrs Willis spoke no word, but I could see that her soul was full of joy. I chanced to glance at Robin, and observed that the waif had retired to the window, and was absolutely wiping his eyes, while Dumps sat observant in the middle of the room, evidently much surprised at, but not much pleased with, the sudden calm which had succeeded the outburst. "Come, Robin," said I, rising, "I think that you and I will leave them. Good bye, granny and Edie. I shall see you again soon." I paused at the door and looked back. "Come, Dumps, come."
My doggie wagged his scrumpy tail, cocked his expressive ears, and glanced from me to his mistress, but did not rise. "Pompey prefers to remain with me," said Edie. "Let him stay."
"Punch is a wise dog," observed Robin, as we descended the stairs together. "But you don't ought to let your spirits go down, sir," he added, with a profoundly sagacious glance, "'cause of course he can't help hisself now. He'll have to stick to whatever 'appens, and to me too."
I understood the meaning of his last words, and could not help smiling at the presumptuous certainty with which he assumed that he was going to follow my fortunes. It is needful to say that when I mentioned what had occurred to Dr McTougall, that amiable little man opened his eyes to their widest. "You young dog!" he exclaimed. "Was it grateful in you to repay all my kindness by robbing me in this sly manner of my governess, nay, I may say, of my daughter, for I have long ago considered her such, and adopted her in my heart?"
"It was not done slyly, I assure you," said I. "Indeed, I fought against the catastrophe with all my might, but I couldn't help it at last. It came upon me, as it were unexpectedly, took me by surprise." "Humph!" ejaculated the doctor. "Besides," I added, "you can scarcely call it robbery, for are not you and I united as partners? So that instead of robbing you, I have, in reality, created another bond of union between you and Edie?" "Humph!" said the doctor. "Moreover," I continued, "it happens most opportunely just now that the house opposite this one is to let. It is a much smaller and lower rented house than this, and admirably suited for a very small family, so that if I secure it, we will scarcely, I may say, have to quit your roof." "Ah, to be sure," returned the doctor, falling in with my humour. "We will have the pleasure of overlooking and criticising each other and our respective households. We may sit at the windows and converse across the street in fine weather, or flatten our noses on the glass and make faces at each other when the weather is bad. Besides, we can have a tunnel cut under the street, and thus have subterranean communications at any time of the day or night. And what a charming place that would be for the children to romp in! Of course we would require to have it made of bricks or cast iron, to prevent the rats connecting it with the sewers, but—" A breeze of pattering feet overhead induced the doctor to pause. It increased to a gale on the staircase, to a tempest in the lobby. The door was burst open, and Jack and Harry and Job and Jenny and Dolly, with blazing cheeks and eyes, tumbled tumultuously into the room. "Oh, papa!" screamed Harry, "Lily's been out and found her mother." "No, it's not, it's her gandmother!" shrieked Dolly. "Yes, and Dr Mellon's going to marry her!" cried Jenny.
"Who? The grandmother?" asked the doctor, with a surprised look.
"No, Lily!" they all cried, with a shout of laughter, which Jack checked by stoutly asserting that it was her great grandmother that Lily had found. This drew an emphatic "No, it's not!" from Job, and a firmly reiterated assertion that it was "only her grandmother" from Dolly. "But Robin said so!" cried Jack. "No, he didn't!" said Job. "Yes, he did!" cried Harry. "Robin says she's found her gandmother," said Dolly. "I'll go and ask 'em," cried Jenny, and turning round she rushed out of the room. The others faced about, as one child, and the tempest swept back into the lobby, moderated to a gale on the staircase, and was reduced to a breeze, afterwards to a temporary calm, overhead. Before it burst forth again, the doctor and I had put on our hats and left the house. From that date forward, for many weeks, the number of lost grandmothers that were found in the McTougall nursery surpasses belief. They were discovered in all sorts of places, and in all imaginable circumstances,
under beds, tables, upturned baths and basin stands, in closets, trunks, and cupboards, and always in a condition of woeful weakness and melancholy destitution. The part of grandmother was invariably assigned to Dolly, because, although the youngest of the group, that little creature possessed a power of acting and of self control which none of the others could equal. At first they were careful to keep as close to the original event as possible, but after a time, thirsting for variety, they became lax, and the grandmothers were found not only by granddaughters, but by daughters and cousins and nieces and nephews. But the play never varied in the points of extreme poverty and woe, because Dolly refused, with invincible determination, to change or modify her part. After a time they varied the performance with a wedding, in which innumerable Dr Mellons were united to endless Lilly Blythes. But after the real wedding took place, and the cake had been utterly consumed, they returned to their first love, lost and found, as they termed it, or the "Ganmovers' play." So, in course of time, the house over the way was actually taken and furnished. Edie was installed therein as empress, I as her devoted slave, when not otherwise engaged; and, to say the truth, even when I was otherwise engaged, I always managed to leave my heart at home. Anatomists may, perhaps, be puzzled by this statement. If so, let them be puzzled. Ganmover was also installed as queen daughter, in a suite of apartments consisting of one room and a closet. It was not in Dr McTougall's nursery alone that the game of Lost and Found was played. In a little schoolroom not far distant from our abode, that game was played by Edie, assisted by Robin Slidder and myself, with considerable success. Robin crossed the street to me, came over, as it were, with Edith, the conqueror, and our Doggie, and afterwards became a most valuable ally in searching for, drawing forth, tempting out, and gathering in the lost. He and I sought for them in some of the lowest slums of London. Robin's knowledge of their haunts and ways, and his persuasive voice, had influence where none but himself, or someone like him, could have made any impression. We tempted them to our little hall with occasional feasts, in which buns, oranges, raisins, gingerbread, and tea played prominent parts; and when we had gathered them in, Edith came to them, like an angel of light, and preached to them the gospel of Jesus, at once by example, tone, look, and word. Among others who came to our little social meetings was the Slogger. That unpunished criminal not only launched with, apparently, heart and soul into the good cause, but he was the means of inducing many others to come; and when, in after years, his old comrade, Mr Brassey, returned from his enforced residence in foreign parts, the Slogger sought for and found him, and stuck to him with the pertinacity of his bulldog nature until he fairly brought him in. Thus that good work went on with us. Thus it is going on at the present time in many, many parts of our favoured land; and thus it will go on, with God's blessing, until his people shall all be gathered into the fold of the Good Shepherd. Until that day, when the puzzlements and bewilderments of this incomprehensible life shall be cleared up; when we shall be enabled to understand why man has been so long permitted to dwell in the midst of conflicting good and evil, and why he has been required to live on earth by faith and not by sight, trusting in the unquestionable goodness and wisdom of Him who is our life and our light. In all our work, whether temporal or spiritual, we had the help and powerful sympathy of our friend Dr McTougall and his family; also of his friend Dobson, the city man, who was a strong man in more ways than one, and a zealous champion of righteousness, or rightness, as he was fond of calling it, in contradistinction to wrongness. I meant to let fall the curtain at this point, but something which I cannot explain induces me to keep it up a few minutes longer, in order to tell you that the little McTougall's grew up to be splendid men and women. that dear old granny is still alive and well, insomuch that she bids fair to become a serene centenarian; that my sweet Edie is now fair, fat, and 40; that I am gray and hearty; that Dumps is grayer, and so fat, as well as stiff, that he wags his ridiculous tail with the utmost difficulty; that Brassey and the Slogger have gone into partnership in the green grocery line round the corner; and that Robin Slidder is no longer a boy, but has become a man and a butler. He is still in our service, and declares that he will never leave it. My firm conviction is that he will keep his word as long as he can. So now, amiable reader, with regret and the best of wishes, we make our final bow wow, and bid you good bye, my Doggie and I. End of Project Gutenberg End of My Doggie and I, by Robert Ballantyne. Recorded by Allyson Hester in Athens, Georgia.